Listen carefully because what you're about to hear is not comfortable, not flattering, and not something people usually say out loud. If a younger woman wants a secret connection with you, she will almost never confess it directly. She won't sit you down and explain her intentions. Instead, she will let you feel it, sense it, and slowly question yourself. And most men completely misunderstand what's actually happening. You might think her silence means uncertainty. You might assume her distance means disinterest. You might tell yourself she's just confused, playing games, or wasting your time. But what if the truth is far more unsettling? What if her secrecy is not a lack of feeling, but a sign that the feeling is too intense to handle openly? There is a psychology behind hidden desire that most people never learn. A psychology where attraction and fear exist at the same time, where closeness feels irresistible in private yet dangerous in public, where mixed signals are not manipulation, but an internal battle between what she wants and who she believes she should be. And here's the part that will challenge your ego. The more you chase clarity, the more you push her away. The more you demand answers, the deeper she retreats. Not because she doesn't care, but because pressure turns desire into fear. If you've ever felt someone pull you close emotionally only to step back the moment things feel real, if you've ever been treated like a secret while being given deep emotional access, if you've ever wondered why the connection feels powerful yet unstable, then this conversation is for you, because this video is not about decoding her behavior. It's about understanding your position in the dynamic. It's about recognizing when silence speaks louder than words, when distance hides attachment, and when your reaction determines whether things collapse or clarify. Stay with me until the end, because once you see the pattern, you'll never misread it again. And more importantly, you'll never lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who hasn't decided who they want to be yet. Let's begin by correcting the biggest misunderstanding men have about secrecy. Most people assume that when something is hidden, it is weak, casual, or temporary, but psychologically, secrecy is often born from the opposite. It comes from intensity, from something that feels too powerful to be handled openly. A younger woman who wants a secret connection is rarely emotionally absent. In many cases, she is emotionally flooded. When a feeling is mild, people talk about it easily. They name it. They share it. But when a feeling threatens identity, reputation, future plans, or self-image, the mind instinctively moves it into the shadows. Not because it lacks value, but because it has too much. Secrecy becomes a form of emotional containment, a way to keep desire from spilling into areas of life where it could cause irreversible change. You have to understand the internal conflict she is navigating. On one side is attraction that feels grounding, stimulating, and emotionally validating. On the other side is the voice of society, family expectations, peer judgment, and her own long-term narrative about who she is supposed to be. When those two sides collide, the mind doesn't choose one immediately. It delays, it hides. It creates a private space where the feeling can exist without forcing a decision. This is why many younger women who want secrecy are not confused about the man. They are conflicted about themselves. The attraction doesn't fit neatly into the version of life they have imagined. And when something doesn't fit, the first instinct is not rejection, it is concealment. There is also an important philosophical layer here. Desire that feels forbidden often feels amplified. When something exists outside public approval, it gains psychological intensity. The secrecy itself adds charge, not because it is immoral, but because it feels rare, personal, and protected from noise. In that private space, she doesn't have to perform. She doesn't have to explain. She can simply feel. This is why secrecy should never be interpreted as a lack of seriousness. In fact, many women hide what they take most seriously. They publicize what is safe to lose. What is uncertain, they protect quietly. What is deeply affecting them, they guard closely. Another critical factor is risk perception. Younger women are acutely aware that visibility has consequences. Being seen changes how people treat you. Being known changes how choices are judged. A secret relationship allows her to experience emotional closeness without triggering those external consequences. It buys time, time to understand her feelings, time to assess the man, time to see whether the connection is a passing intensity or a meaningful disruption. And this is where many men make a mistake. They assume secrecy means casual intent, so they treat it lightly, or they assume it means manipulation, so they react with ego. Both responses miss the psychological reality. Secrecy is not casualness, it is caution paired with desire. Notice how her emotions behave in private. They are not shallow, they are not playful in a careless way. They are deliberate, thoughtful, sometimes intense. She remembers what you say. She reacts to your moods. She notices shifts in your tone. That level of attention does not come from someone who feels nothing. It comes from someone who feels enough to be careful. There is also fear involved, but it is not fear of you, it is fear of collapse, fear that once something is spoken aloud, it cannot be taken back. Words create structure, structure demands action, silence keeps options open. For someone still integrating their emotions, silence feels safer than certainty. From a psychological perspective, secrecy is often a transitional phase. It is the mind's way of saying, this matters, but I am not ready to define it yet. The danger arises when the man tries to force that definition prematurely. Pressure converts intensity into anxiety, and anxiety does not lead to truth. It leads to withdrawal. The wiser approach is understanding without entitlement, calm without passivity, presence without pressure. When a woman senses that you are emotionally grounded, not reactive, not desperate for validation, her fear reduces, and when fear reduces, clarity becomes possible. It is also essential to recognize that secrecy is not always permanent. Sometimes it is simply the early stage of a connection that is still being evaluated against reality, but whether it evolves or dissolves depends largely on how safe she feels emotionally, not how much you demand reassurance. If you react to secrecy with suspicion, you confirm her fear. If you react with arrogance, you increase risk. If you react with patience and self-respect, you create an environment where she can eventually choose honestly rather than defensively. And here is the deeper truth most people never hear. Secrecy reveals not a lack of courage, but a lack of internal alignment. When desire and identity are not yet integrated, hiding feels easier than choosing. Your role is not to rescue her from that conflict. Your role is to observe, remain composed, and decide whether you are willing to exist in that space without losing yourself. Because the moment you compromise your dignity to gain access to hidden affection, the dynamic collapses. Secrecy only works when both people remain psychologically intact. The strongest position is not impatience or withdrawal. It is clarity within yourself. And this leads to a final realization. The question is not whether her secrecy means something. It does. The real question is whether you respect yourself enough to respond with wisdom rather than impulse. Understand this, and you stop chasing explanations. You stop personalizing silence. You stop confusing hidden desire with absence of feeling. And when you do that, you become the kind of man who is not intimidated by intensity, not destabilized by uncertainty, and not dependent on validation. Because the most powerful thing you can offer someone who is hiding their feelings is not pressure. It is stability. Now let's talk about one of the most revealing dynamics in human behavior, because once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Private closeness paired with public distance is not mixed signaling. It is not company. Incidence. It is one of the clearest psychological indicators of a hidden emotional bond. When a woman allows deep emotional access in private but consciously creates space in public, she is not being cold. She is being strategic, and strategy always forms around something valuable. People do not manage what they do not care about. They manage what they fear losing control over. In private, she is present. Her attention is focused. Her energy softens. Conversation flows into vulnerable territory without effort. She listens, remembers, responds emotionally rather than intellectually. This is not surface-level engagement. Emotional intimacy requires trust, safety, and a willingness to be seen. If she gives you that behind closed doors, it means you occupy psychological importance. But the moment others enter the environment, something changes. Her posture shifts, her tone becomes neutral, she increases physical space, she avoids shared signals that could be interpreted by others. This shift is not about you, it is about perception. Public spaces introduce witnesses, and witnesses introduce consequences. Psychologically, humans operate very differently when observed. Being seen activates identity maintenance. It forces a person to align behavior with the version of themselves they want the world to accept. For a younger woman, especially one navigating expectations, reputation, or internalized rules about how her life should look, public association carries weight. It defines her, it labels her, and labels feel permanent. So she splits the experience. She keeps the emotional truth in private, where it can exist without being judged, and controls the narrative in public, where judgment is unavoidable. This split is exhausting, but it feels safer than exposure. Most men misinterpret this dynamic. They assume public distance means lack of attraction. But attraction does not disappear in public. It gets restrained. Desire doesn't switch off. It gets managed. And restraint requires effort. Effort signals importance. There is also a power component here that is rarely discussed. Public acknowledgement removes ambiguity. It locks the dynamic into a social reality. Once others see it, it becomes harder to exit quietly, harder to revise the story, harder to protect oneself if things change. Private closeness keeps options open. It allows her to feel without committing to visibility. Another layer is emotional risk. Public association raises the stakes. It invites opinions, interference, and expectations. In private, the connection belongs to the two of you. In public, it belongs to everyone. For someone who is still evaluating the depth and direction of her feelings, that loss of control feels threatening. This is why her warmth often returns the moment privacy is restored, the safety returns, the guard lowers, and suddenly she is the version of herself that felt authentic and emotionally available. That contrast can feel confusing if you don't understand it, but once you do, it becomes information rather than frustration. However, this dynamic also carries an important warning. Private closeness without eventual public integration can become a psychological trap if you allow it to erode your self-respect. Intimacy without acknowledgement can feel intoxicating at first, but over time it can create imbalance. One person holds emotional access, while the other absorbs the cost of invisibility. This is why your response matters more than her behavior. If you internalize public distance as rejection, you will chase validation. If you accept it without boundaries, you will diminish yourself. The balanced position is awareness without surrender. Observe how she treats you when no one is watching. Observe whether the emotional investment is consistent, respectful, and reciprocal. Private closeness should feel grounding, not draining. If it begins to feel like you are only allowed into fragments of her life, that is no longer secrecy born of fear. That is avoidance born of convenience. There is also a moral clarity required here. Secrecy should not cost you your integrity. If the dynamic requires you to lie, shrink, or deny your own needs, the price is too high. Psychological understanding is not permission for self-betrayal. What many men don't realize is that public distance can only exist comfortably when private closeness is deeply respectful. If she values you, she will protect your dignity even in secrecy. She will not mock you publicly. She will not contradict you to maintain an image. She will simply manage visibility quietly. The moment disrespect enters, the meaning changes. From a philosophical perspective, this dynamic reveals how modern identity works. People are not just managing relationships, they are managing narratives. Who they are seen as matters almost as much as who they actually are. And when those two selves are not aligned yet, private and public behavior will diverge. Your role is not to force alignment. Alignment happens internally, not under pressure. Your role is to remain centered, calm, self-aware. When you don't react emotionally to public distance, you remove one of the biggest sources of fear. You show her that your sense of self does not depend on being displayed. Ironically, this is what often leads to change. When safety increases, fear decreases. When fear decreases, authenticity becomes possible, but this only works if you are genuinely grounded, not pretending to be indifferent while secretly hoping for validation. And here is the critical insight. Private closeness paired with public distance is a test, not of your patience, but of your self-respect. Can you enjoy intimacy without demanding proof? Can you stay present without losing your standards? Can you observe without rushing to control the outcome? If you can, you remain powerful regardless of where the situation leads. Because the man who understands the difference between being hidden and being disrespected never settles for confusion. He chooses clarity within himself first. Now let's address the part that confuses men the most and damages them the fastest: mixed signals. Because when a younger woman sends hot and cold behavior, most men label it as manipulation or emotional immaturity. But that interpretation is shallow. Mixed signals are rarely about playing games. They are about internal conflict. When a woman truly feels nothing, her behavior is consistent. Indifference is simple. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't require effort. But inconsistency requires energy. And people only spend energy where there is emotional charge. Mixed signals appear when desire and resistance exist at the same time. One part of her is pulled toward the connection. Another part is pushing away from it. These parts are not coordinated. They take turns controlling her behavior. And when that happens, what you experience is inconsistency. One day she is emotionally open, warm, expressive, even affectionate. The next day she becomes distant, formal, cautious. This shift is not random. It reflects which internal voice is louder at that moment. Desire speaks when she feels safe. Fear speaks when she feels exposed. Fear doesn't always come from you. It comes from imagined futures. From what does this mean about me? From what if this goes too far? From what if people find out? From what if I lose control? These questions don't disappear just because attraction exists. In fact, attraction intensifies them. Psychologically, this creates cognitive dissonance. Her feelings are pulling her in one direction. Her beliefs about how her life should look are pulling her in another. The mind hates this tension, but instead of resolving it immediately, it oscillates. That oscillation is what you see as mixed signals. Here's where men go wrong. They respond emotionally to the fluctuation. When she pulls away, they chase. When she comes close, they overinvest. This reaction feeds the instability. It turns internal conflict into relational chaos. A grounded man understands that inconsistency is information, not instruction. It tells you she is not settled within herself yet. It does not automatically mean you should pursue harder or withdraw dramatically. It means you should slow down emotionally and observe. Another important distinction must be made. Confusion looks chaotic. Inner conflict looks patterned. Mixed signals from conflict follow a rhythm: warmth in private, distance after intimacy, pulling back after moments of closeness. These patterns repeat because the internal struggle repeats. Random inconsistency has no pattern. Emotional conflict does. This is why labeling her behavior as toxic too quickly is a mistake. Toxicity is intentional harm. Conflict is unresolved self-contradiction. One deserves boundaries, the other deserves understanding without self-sacrifice. There is also a deeper philosophical element here. Desire challenges identity. When someone enters your life and destabilizes your sense of who you are or where you are going, the mind resists. Not because he person is wrong, but because change is threatening. Growth often feels like danger before it feels like clarity. Mixed signals are often the sound of a person standing at the edge of transformation, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. That doesn't make them weak, it makes them human. However, understanding does not mean tolerating emotional harm. This is where self-respect becomes essential. You do not punish inconsistency, but you also do not organize your life around it. You remain steady, predictable, calm. That steadiness becomes a mirror. It highlights her instability without you having to point it out. When you remain emotionally regulated, something interesting happens. The inconsistency becomes uncomfortable for her, not because you demand answers, but because your calm exposes the lack of alignment within her. And that discomfort forces a decision. Either she integrates her feelings or she withdraws completely. What you must never do is become part of the fluctuation. The moment you start matching her highs and lows, you lose authority. Emotional authority does not come from intensity. It comes from consistency. There is also an important warning here. Mixed signals should not be romanticized. Prolonged inconsistency without progression is not depth. It is stagnation. Emotional conflict that never resolves becomes emotional avoidance, and avoidance is not a foundation for anything meaningful. So the question you should ask yourself is not, why is she so confusing? The better question is, am I grounded enough to not lose myself in someone else's uncertainty? If you feel anxious, preoccupied, or emotionally destabilized by her inconsistency, is your signal to step back internally, not to punish her, not to threaten distance, but to recenter yourself. Your emotional state should never be at the mercy of someone else's unresolved inner world. There is strength in allowing space without disappearing, in maintaining interest without urgency, in being present without attachment to outcome. That balance communicates something powerful. I'm open, but I'm not dependent. And dependency is what intensifies fear. When she senses that her indecision controls you, her anxiety increases. When she senses that you remain whole regardless of her fluctuations, safety increases. Safety does not guarantee commitment, but it is the only condition under which clarity can emerge. And here is the final truth that matters most. Mixed signals are not a puzzle to solve. They are a situation to navigate with dignity. You don't win by decoding her every move. You win by staying aligned with yourself, because the man who can remain calm in the presence of emotional contradiction does not chase certainty from others. He becomes certain within himself. Now let's move into one of the most misunderstood behaviors in modern relationships, the refusal to define the connection. No labels, no titles, no clear direction. And most men hear this and immediately assume one thing, that she wants freedom without responsibility, that she wants benefits without commitment. But again, that interpretation is shallow, because psychologically, avoiding labels is rarely about carelessness. It is about control and safety. A label is not just a word, a label is a contract. The moment something is named, it becomes real in a way that can no longer be undone quietly. Once you call something a relationship, it gains weight. It invites expectations. It invites scrutiny, it invites consequences. And for someone who is emotionally invested but internally conflicted, that weight can feel overwhelming. When a younger woman avoids labels, she is not necessarily avoiding depth. Often, she is protecting herself from exposure. Labels create visibility. Visibility creates accountability. Accountability creates pressure, and pressure forces decisions before the mind feels ready. Think about it carefully. If she truly felt nothing, she wouldn't need to avoid labels. She would simply disengage. Indifference doesn't negotiate definitions, it exits. The act of keeping things undefined requires effort, and effort signals importance. From a psychological standpoint, ambiguity functions as a buffer. It allows her to experience connection without triggering the part of her identity that fears judgment, permanence, or loss of control. In that undefined space, she can feel without committing to a future version of herself she hasn't accepted yet. There is also an identity issue at play. Labels force people to integrate new roles into their self-concept. Girlfriend, partner, involved. Those words don't just describe a dynamic. They redefine how someone sees themselves and how they believe others will see them. For a younger woman who is still shaping her identity, that can feel threatening, even if the connection itself feels good. This is why she might say things like, "Why do we need to put a name on it?" Or "Let's just see where it goes." These statements are often misunderstood as emotional laziness, but more often, They are emotional caution. She is buying time. Time to reconcile desire with self-image. Time to see if the intensity stabilizes or destabilizes her life. Another layer here is control over narrative. When something is labeled, the story is no longer private. It becomes shareable. It becomes discussable. Others get to have opinions. And once opinions enter, autonomy shrinks. Undefined connections remain psychologically owned by the people inside them. But here's where it becomes dangerous for men. Ambiguity can feel comfortable at first. It can feel mature, flexible, modern. But over time, it can quietly erode self-respect if you are not grounded. If you stay undefined while emotionally investing as if it is defined, you create imbalance. And imbalance always leads to resentment. This is why clarity within yourself matters more than clarity from her. You do not need to force a label to maintain dignity, but you do need to know what you are participating in. Undefined does not mean limitless. Undefined does not mean you abandon your standards. A psychologically healthy response to label avoidance is not pressure and it is not passive acceptance. It is calm self-awareness. You can allow ambiguity without dissolving your boundaries. You can remain present without pretending you don't care. That balance communicates strength. Another important truth is this: labels make things irreversible. Once named, retreat feels like failure, and fear of failure is powerful, especially for someone who already feels conflicted, so she keeps the door half open. Not to manipulate you, but to protect herself from the pain of committing to something she might later feel unable to sustain. But ambiguity cannot last forever. Undefined spaces are meant to be transitional, not permanent. Over time, the lack of definition stops feeling safe and starts feeling unstable. And this is where your behavior again becomes crucial. If you become emotionally anxious, constantly seeking reassurance, you increase pressure. If you become emotionally absent, pretending you don't care, you create distance. Both extremes confirm her fear that definition equals loss. The middle path is emotional steadiness. You show up consistently. You speak honestly without ultimatums. You don't rush her, but you also don't disappear into vagueness. You let your presence communicate reliability, and reliability is what slowly makes definition feel less dangerous. However, there is a hard truth that must be said. Some people hide behind ambiguity not because they are conflicted, but because they are avoiding responsibility entirely. Psychological understanding should not blind you to patterns. If time passes and nothing evolves, if intimacy deepens but respect does not, if you are always waiting and never chosen, then ambiguity has become avoidance. Wisdom is knowing the difference between fear and refusal. Fear softens over time with safety. Refusal stays rigid. Fear wrestles. Refusal stalls. Your responsibility is not to rescue someone from fear. Your responsibility is to not abandon yourself while being patient. You can say without drama, I value clarity in my life. Not as a demand, as a truth. And then you watch what happens. People who value you will eventually meet you there. People who don't will drift away. Both outcomes give you clarity. From a philosophical angle, this entire dynamic reveals something deeper about modern relationships. Many people want the emotional benefits of connection without the existential weight of choice. But growth always requires choice, and choice always involves risk. Avoiding labels delays that confrontation. It postpones growth. It keeps life emotionally comfortable but internally stagnant. And the longer someone stays there, the harder it becomes to move forward with integrity. So the real question is not whether she avoids labels. The real question is whether you are willing to stay anchored while ambiguity plays out, or whether you are slowly shrinking to fit someone else's fear, because the moment you sacrifice your inner clarity to maintain external connection, the relationship loses its value. And here is the final truth to take with you. Clarity is not created by forcing words. It is created by standing firmly in who you are and letting others decide whether they are brave enough to meet you there. Now we arrive at the point that quietly determines everything, yet is spoken about the least. Calm, masculine composure, not silence, not emotional withdrawal, but grounded presence. This is the axis around which all the other dynamics turn. When a woman is internally conflicted, secrecy, mixed signals, public distance, and avoidance of labels are not random behaviors. They are symptoms of fear interacting with desire. And fear is not calmed by pressure. Fear is not soothed by chasing. Fear is not resolved by emotional intensity. Fear responds to stability. Most men underestimate how deeply their emotional regulation affects the psychology of the woman they are dealing with. When you react quickly, demand clarity, express frustration, or oscillate between warmth and withdrawal, you don't just communicate interest, you communicate volatility. And volatility feels unsafe to someone who is already unsure. Calm composure is not about pretending you don't care. It is about not allowing your emotional state to be dictated by her uncertainty. It is the ability to remain steady even when the situation is ambiguous. And that steadiness does something powerful. It lowers psychological threat. From a psychological perspective, humans mirror emotional states unconsciously. When you are calm, you become a regulating force. Your nervous system signals safety, and safety is the prerequisite for honesty, not obligation, not pressure, safety. This is why men who chase clarity often get the opposite of what they want. The more they push for answers, the more they activate fear. Fear shortens time horizons. It makes people think defensively. And defensive thinking does not produce truth, it produces retreat. A composed man does something different. He observes without reacting. He listens without interrogating. He responds rather than reacts. This creates a subtle shift in power. Not power over her, but power within himself. And people instinctively respect those who are not easily destabilized. There is also a philosophical depth to composure that most people miss. Composure is not emotional suppression. It is emotional integration. You are aware of what you feel, but you are not enslaved by it. That distinction is crucial. Suppression eventually leaks out as resentment. Integration expresses itself as clarity. When a woman senses that you are emotionally self-contained, she feels less responsible for managing your reactions. That reduces her anxiety, and when anxiety reduces, decision-making improves. People make better choices when they are not afraid of emotional fallout. Another important element is dignity. Composure protects your dignity. When you chase someone who is unsure, you signal that your self-worth is negotiable. When you remain grounded while staying open, you signal that connection is a choice, not a necessity. That signal changes the entire dynamic. This does not mean you tolerate disrespect. Calm composure includes boundaries. You don't argue about them, you don't dramatize them, you live them. You don't need to threaten withdrawal. You simply don't overextend yourself where there is no reciprocity. This is where many men confuse patience with passivity. They are not the same. Patience is active self-control. Passivity is avoidance. A patient man stays engaged but does not chase outcomes. A passive man waits while hoping. Hope without agency becomes weakness. Composure also protects you from illusion. When you are emotionally regulated, you see patterns clearly. You notice whether behavior evolves or stagnates. You notice whether intimacy deepens or simply repeats. Emotional calm sharpens perception. Emotional desperation distorts it. And here is something uncomfortable but necessary to say. Your calm will not always lead to the outcome you want. Sometimes composure leads to separation, because when fear is not fed, it either resolves or retreats. And not everyone is ready to resolve it. But even in loss, composure preserves self-respect. You walk away whole rather than depleted. And that matters more than temporary attachment. There is also a deeper masculine truth here. A man's value is not measured by how intensely he is desired, but by how securely he exists within himself. Emotional security is magnetic because it is rare. Most people are reactive. Most people are anxious. Calm presence stands out. This is why composure is not about strategy. It is about identity. You are not acting calm to get a result. You are calm because you are anchored. And when calm is authentic, it influences the environment naturally. When you stop trying to control how the story unfolds, something paradoxical happens. You become more influential. Because people trust those who are not trying to manipulate outcomes. They sense sincerity, they sense strength. Calm composure also gives her space to face herself. Without your pressure, she must confront her own conflict. She can no longer blame urgency or expectation. She must ask, what do I actually want? And whatever answer emerges, it is more honest. If she chooses you, it will not be out of fear or urgency, it will be out of clarity, and clarity creates stability. If she walks away, it will not be because you failed to convince her, it will be because she was not ready to align. Either way, you are not diminished, and this brings us to the final insight that ties everything together. You do not win by decoding her behavior. You do not win by chasing certainty. You do not win by forcing clarity. You win by becoming the kind of man whose presence is calm, whose boundaries are quiet, and whose self-worth does not depend on being chosen. Because when you master composure, you are no longer reacting to secrecy, mixed signals, distance, or ambiguity. You are choosing yourself first, and a man who chooses himself never loses, no matter how the story ends.